On April 13, 2026, Mark Carney turned a fragile minority into a governing majority in Canada, with 5 opposition MPs crossing the floor and key wins in Ontario and Quebec, helping blunt the political pressure that had built around the Trump era. The result gave Carney a stronger parliamentary lock on power and, for now, a clearer path to govern without living vote to vote like a political hostage. The numbers were the point. What had looked like a shaky hold on power suddenly became a majority that could reshape the agenda, and it did so in the provinces that usually decide whether a federal leader survives or gets gaslit into irrelevance. Ontario and Quebec delivered the kind of seat gains that make the whole room stop scrolling, because in Canadian politics, those 2 provinces are not background noise. They are the main event. 5 opposition MPs crossing over also changed the math fast. In a parliament where every seat mattered, those defections were not symbolic, they were structural, the kind of move that can flip a government from defensive to dominant in one night. Carney's team had been under pressure to prove it could hold together, and instead it got a result that made the opposition look like it had walked into a reality TV elimination round and forgotten the script. The victory also landed in a political climate shaped by Donald Trump's return to hard-edged pressure politics, which had been hanging over Canada like a bad season nobody asked for. Carney's win did not erase that pressure, but it did give Ottawa more room to respond with leverage instead of panic. For a government trying to project stability, that mattered more than the usual victory lap. Still, the result did not come out of nowhere. The seat gains, the defections, and the collapse of opposition resistance were only the visible part of a much longer shift that had been building underneath the headlines. But the victory was built on a much longer political shock. Donald Trump's return to tariff threats, annexation talk, and election interference allegations forced Canada's 2026 campaign to become a referendum on sovereignty, trade, and political competence. And Mark Carney's crisis management profile quickly began to overshadow Pierre Poilievre's populist pitch in a race that had been expected to revolve around domestic affordability and anger politics. The agenda kept getting yanked back to Washington, where Trump's pressure campaign made stability look like the most valuable brand in the room. The shift was not subtle. Trump's 25% tariff threats on Canadian goods, along with repeated comments that Canada should be treated as a subordinate economy, injected a level of external risk that made every federal promise sound like a test of could actually absorb a shock. Ottawa's response was not built around slogans. It was built around contingency planning, market access, and the kind of sober language that plays well when voters are wondering whether the next headline will hit their paychecks. That is where Carney's resume mattered, because in a campaign shaped by chaos, a former central banker who speaks in risk models suddenly looked less like a technocrat and more like a fire marshal. Poilievre, by contrast, kept trying to run a clean domestic populist campaign in a race that refused to stay domestic. His attack lines on taxes, housing, and bureaucracy still landed with core supporters. But the larger political environment kept asking a different question. Who can handle a president who treats trade like a hostage note? The problem was not that Poilievre lacked a message. The problem was that Trump kept changing the channel. And every time he did, Carney looked like the adult in the room while Poilievre looked stuck in a permanent campaign loop. The annexation rhetoric was especially corrosive because it did not just irritate Canadian voters. It forced the entire campaign to become a test of national confidence, even when Trump's comments were framed as provocation or leverage. They landed in a country with a long memory of U.S. pressure and a deep allergy to being gaslit about its own sovereignty. That dynamic gave Carney a powerful opening. He could talk about resilience, institutional discipline, and economic defense without sounding theatrical, while Poilievre's harder-edged style risked looking like reality TV politics in a moment that rewarded steadiness. Election interference allegations added another layer of damage to the opposition field because they fed a broader sense that the old rules were no longer holding. Reports and political claims around foreign influence, digital manipulation, and cross-border messaging did not need to prove a single mastermind to shape the campaign. They only needed to reinforce the idea that Canada was being pulled into a wider information war. In that environment, Carney's measured tone played as competence, while Poilievre's confrontational style sometimes blurred into the same noise voters were already trying to tune out. By late campaign season, the contrast had hardened into a simple media narrative. Carney as the crisis manager, Poilievre as the populist who could rally a crowd, but not necessarily calm a country. That framing mattered because Canadian elections are often decided less by ideological purity than by which leader appears least likely to improvise through a national emergency. The numbers looked impossible until the floor crossings began. Canada's political map shifted in 2025 as Justin Trudeau's collapse cleared the stage for Mark Carney, whose central bank resume gave the Liberal leader a credibility edge in a campaign defined by economic anxiety and sovereignty fears. Across the aisle, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre tried to hold Carleton as a symbolic stronghold, but the larger national picture was already moving against him. Trudeau's fall was not a single event story so much as a slow-motion breakdown that left the governing brand exposed and the opposition smelling blood. By the time Carney emerged as the party's answer, the pitch was simple: steady hands, institutional discipline, and a man who had spent years inside the machinery of monetary policy rather than on the campaign trail playing political mascot. That mattered in a country where voters were no longer asking for a slogan. They were asking who could keep the floor from dropping out. Carney's appeal came from pedigree, but also from timing. A former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, he entered federal politics with the kind of resume that sounds boring until markets start acting like a Karen at customer service, demanding immediate proof that somebody is in charge. His background made him look less like a rookie and more like a crisis manager with a spreadsheet, which is exactly the kind of energy that plays when the national mood turns defensive. Poilievre's Carleton base, meanwhile, became the political equivalent of a locked studio set, familiar, loyal, and no longer enough to carry the whole season. The writing remained a marker of his personal power, but it also underscored the limits of a campaign built around permanent confrontation. He could still rally the core crowd, sure, but the broader electorate was drifting toward a different question. Not who could win the argument online, but who could actually govern through the mess. Then came the 2025 election, and it redrew Canada's political balance in blunt, unsentimental terms. The vote did not just hand Carney a mandate. It reordered the assumptions that had shaped the race from the start, turning what had looked like a narrow contest into a broader referendum on competence, stability, and national defense. In that kind of environment, small shifts became structural shifts, and every seat started to matter, like it was the last one on the call sheet. The result also exposed how quickly the opposition's math could break once the campaign stopped being theoretical. Conservative hopes rested on the idea that discontent would stay local, and that anger over taxes, housing, and bureaucracy would be enough to overpower the federal mood. But the 2025 map showed a different reality. When voters are staring at a volatile external threat, they tend to reward the person who looks least likely to improvise. That is why the floor-crossing chatter hit so hard. Once the election had reset the balance, even a single defection stopped looking like noise and started looking like confirmation that the old alignment was cracking in real time. Then one Conservative defection made the shift undeniable. Former Conservative MP Gerard Deltel said the party's internal split over Canada's future had become impossible to ignore, while fellow Conservative MP Richard Lahou warned that uncertainty was now doing the real damage in Ottawa. Their comments landed as Prime Minister Mark Carney projected a deliberately sober tone, signaling that the government was treating the political realignment as a serious national test rather than a routine power shift. That seriousness matters because the pressure is not coming from inside Parliament alone. Donald Trump has kept reviving his 51st state rhetoric, turning what once sounded like offhand provocation into a persistent background threat that now hangs over Canada's political class like a bad reality show reboot nobody asked for. In that context, every move by Ottawa gets read through a sovereignty lens, and every hesitation starts looking like weakness. Gladys' warning about uncertainty cuts to the core of the moment. The issue is not just that voters are uneasy, it is that the old assumption that Canada's party lines would hold under stress is starting to look outdated. When a conservative caucus begins to wobble under the weight of external pressure, the story stops being about one defection and starts becoming about whether the entire alignment is still built for the world it claims to govern. Carney's response has been to lean into institutional gravity, not performative noise. He has presented himself as the adult in the room, the guy who does not need to yell over the chaos because he is already standing in the control booth. That approach has given him a credibility edge with voters who are less interested in political theater than in whether somebody can keep the lights on when the room starts shaking. The comparison to earlier eras is what makes this shift feel so rare. Canada has seen major political resets before, but the scale and speed of this one invite comparisons to the kind of realignment associated with Sir John A. Macdonald's nation-building politics and Jean Chrétien's era of consolidation. Those were moments when the country's governing logic changed, not just the occupant of the chair. Macdonald's coalition building helped define the architecture of confederation, while Chrétien's long run reflected a different kind of stability, one built on holding the center when the rest of the field was fragmenting. Carney's rise is being measured against that historical backdrop because the current moment is not simply about one party gaining ground. It is about whether Canada is entering a phase where sovereignty, security, and economic management are being fused into a new political order. That comparison exposes how rare this realignment really is. With a majority in hand, Prime Minister Mark Carney now has room to negotiate with Washington from a stronger position because the arithmetic in Ottawa no longer leaves him hostage to every passing revolt or every loud threat from the opposition benches. The shift matters in practical terms. A majority government is far less vulnerable to no-confidence maneuvers, meaning Carney can spend less time counting votes and more time setting the agenda. In plain English, the political drama has not ended, but the remote control has moved back to the Prime Minister's desk. That changes the leverage equation in a way that is hard to overstate. Under a minority setup, every trade dispute, every sovereignty fight, and every policy concession can get turned into a parliamentary hostage situation. With rivals trying to squeeze the government for advantage, a majority strips away much of that leverage from opponents, reducing the odds that domestic instability will dictate Canada's response to external pressure. For Carney, that is the difference between negotiating with one hand tied and walking into the room with both hands on the table. It also gives Ottawa a cleaner message to send abroad. When Canada speaks as a government that can survive a confidence vote, it is easier to argue that its position is durable, not temporary, and that any deal on tariffs, security, or supply chains has real staying power. That stability matters to allies and investors alike, who tend to treat political fragility like a flashing warning light. Nobody in the room wants to sign a long-term arrangement with a government that might get yanked around by the next internal tantrum. The practical payoff is that Carney can now push a resilience-first strategy without having to sell every move as a short-term survival play. That means more room to diversify trade, harden supply chains, and reduce dependence on a single market that has become politically unpredictable. It also means Canada can keep building fallback options in energy, manufacturing, and critical minerals without looking like it is improvising under fire. The message is simple: diversify now or keep getting gaslit by volatility later. There is also a symbolic edge to the majority that should not be ignored. It tells Canadians that the government has enough backing to act, not just enough support to argue, in a moment when sovereignty questions are being treated as live ammunition. That kind of mandate gives Carney a better hand in every conversation that matters. It does not solve the Trump problem by itself, but it does mean Canada is no longer approaching it like a country waiting to be bullied into a corner. That is why the majority changes the tone as much as the tactics. A minority government has to spend its days bracing for collapse. A majority can spend its days building capacity. And in this environment, capacity is the real currency. Because the next confrontation is not just about one tariff or one speech, but about whether Canada can keep broadening its options faster than Washington keeps narrowing them. The next test is whether this mandate can outlast Trump. Canada's response to Trumpism is now an institutional one, not just a rhetorical one, and that is the real story behind Mark Carney's rise in Ottawa. By converting political panic into a governing majority, Canada has signaled that it intends to answer pressure from Washington with structure, not improvisation. That matters because Trump-style politics thrives on instability, leverage, and the assumption that opponents will blink first. A government with a stronger mandate can move faster on trade, supply chains, energy security, and industrial policy without turning every decision into a survival test. In other words, Ottawa is no longer trapped in the kind of daily crisis management that turns policy into a reality show. Side plot: Carney's ascent also says something bigger about what Canadian voters were willing to reward in 2026. The former central banker did not arrive as a classic partisan firebrand. He arrived as a technocratic counterweight to chaos. And that was enough to reshape the race. For a country that spent months staring down tariff threats, sovereignty talk, and political gaslighting from south of the border, competence suddenly looked less like a slogan and more like a defense mechanism. The result is a durable lesson for 2029 and beyond. Anti-Trump politics in Canada is not just about resisting one man, but about building institutions that can absorb external shocks without cracking. That means stronger trade diversification, tighter economic planning, and a political culture that treats volatility as a problem to be managed, not a spectacle to be consumed. If the last campaign was about whether Canada could answer Trump at end all, the next one will be about whether it can keep answering after the headlines move on. There is also a warning buried in the wind. Majority governments do not automatically produce resilience, and mandate alone does not immunize Ottawa from bad decisions, market shocks, or a changing White House. Carney now has room to govern, but he also has less excuse to miss the moment, because voters have effectively handed him the tools to prove that Canada can act like a mature state under pressure. That is why this election should be read less as a one-night upset and more as a stress test passed. Canada did not just reject a political mood, it chose a governing model built to outlast it. The harder question now is whether that model can survive the next cycle of disruption. Because Canada has answered Trump once, can it sustain the answer?